Do you think this is a turning point? Is something happening in some of these big cities?
No, I think that we live in a winner-take-all urban system. London and New York and Toronto, the cities you mentioned, are big winners. Transit ridership is down because people live closer to work and they walk or they bike or they take Uber. All the reasons you've said in the piece, but no, I put a long bet on London. I think London's going to be just fine.
And I mean, I'm interested in that because you do accept that these cities do have long cycles, and London and New York both did have a long cycle, right? They've had their periods of decline.
I mean, there was the period of mass suburbanization after the war that really took the middle class, jobs and industry out of the city. But what we've seen probably over the past 20 or 30 years, and certainly since the turn of the 21st century, this massive movements of jobs, of people, of the affluent and the educated, but also of tech firms. You know, tech firms used to always be located in these suburban office complexes, these nerdistans. They have come barreling back, and the places that have grown them more than anywhere are London, New York, and downtown San Francisco. So I think you're right. If the long cycle after the war was to suburbanization and the shrinkage of the city, the long cycle of the past generation, and certainly of the past decade and a half, has been back to the city. And I think it's not every city. It's big, great world cities like London and New York and a few others you mentioned.
Right. Sian, do you think this is just a transport thing going on? Is something bigger going on?
I think London does have its problems, and one of the interesting parts of why people are not taking so much public transport is that visitors from elsewhere in the UK are down. So that's part of your museum.
So domestic tourism is definitely
down.
And
I think people in Britain, people in London are very squeezed. And one of the reasons why you might not be taking so many journeys is partly because you've replaced them with technology or people delivering to you, but also because you can't afford them.
Oh, well, it is very expensive.
Potentially, you know, you can't afford to go out. I mean, not just the journey, but the reason for the journey. And I think that is worrying. We're also seeing a drop in the number of, say, 20-something people coming to London. Now, that's our
run that past me again. So actually, population is still growing, is the kind of big counter-argument to any of this.
Yes, of course it is. And I mean, London's the world city, international migration.
Younger people, you think the demographics are shifting a little bit, are they?
Yeah, there's a big outflux of families from London, and that's understandable. You've got incredibly high housing costs, air pollution. Nobody particularly wants to raise children in London, and often they can't afford to even if they want to. But also we've seen a drop-off in the number of 20-somethings coming, and that's people like me. You know, I'm not from London. I came in my 20s seeking my fortune, and those are the sorts of people we absolutely have to keep attracting. And from the rest of the UK,
but you see, you can't
they're not seeing London as an attractive place as much as they were.
You can't spend a week in London if you haven't got a job, basically, before you get here, because
no, exactly. But I turned up without a job. I turned up with nothing but an overdraft, and I managed to survive because you know, it was possible back then to get a bit of money together, but it's astronomical costs now. I think people may be choosing other cities, and London can't be taking its place for granted.
Richard Flores, I just wonder whether you're being too optimistic about the limits that you reach. Limits of congestion, rental costs, rents as a percentage of earnings. And you just do reach a point where you just say, OK, that's it. We have 30 years of growth, and then it stops.
So 2 points, and she's absolutely right. First point is London will continue to grow. London has overcome bigger problems than a decline in transit ridership. It's gone through several world wars. It's burned to the ground. It is the most resilient city on the planet, and maybe New York in second place. But it is a tale of two cities, and that's something we didn't talk about and that she just brought up. Right. London has replaced working people with rich people, young people with old wealthy people. The people who use transit tend to be working people and less advantaged people. The affluent people coming to London don't live in London full-time. They're part-time residents. They own a big flat. They don't take transit. They take a car-sharing service, their own private car, or they take an Uber or something like that. So I think the decline in transit ridership doesn't reflect the decline of London as a city. It reflects the big divide, social divide in London as a community.
That's a really interesting point. Now, look, I'm just going to give the northern perspective on this, Sian. London's had all the money spent on transport over the last X decades. The North has craved some of it. And London's going to be basically saying, actually, we need a subsidy to pay for this stuff because we've built it now and it's not being used as we anticipated.
Well, we have had a lot of transport investment, but we still do need more. We have to carry on the shift from cars, which has been a 20-year shift, onto public transport, but the North needs investment too. I mean, if I was to swap something, I'd swap HS2 for a high-speed railway linking up the cities in the north. That's the kind of thing that we should be seeing.
But isn't this going to be taken as a sign that, you know, Crossrail 2, that money can be cancelled, that can be spent up on the northern powerhouse? There's a million things that suddenly all of that's open again, isn't it?
No, there's an awful lot of development that still needs to go on in London. We are desperately short of new housing for our families. Affordable housing needs to be built, and that needs to be built in areas that can be opened up by Crossrail 2, that need that transport investment, but also need investment in more mundane things like better buses. At the moment, we're seeing some of our bus routes being cut due to the squeeze, due to the lack of fare income. Yeah. We actually need the government to be giving us more powers and more money from the car income that they get. They don't give us any of it.
Very, very briefly, Richard, Florida, you wrote famously about the creative class that kind of made these big world cities such dynamic places. Has that creative class grown a bit less creative and a bit old and stuffy? Is that the sort of...
It's certainly been the case that the creative class revival has been a crisis of success. My new book is called The New Urban Crisis, just out in London, actually. London is an epicenter of this, but I think what she said is very important. The way London grows in the future is to expand its boundaries, to include those northern industrial cities connected by high-speed rail. It not only grows denser itself, it connects to these external areas, and high-speed rail and that kind of transit is London's future.